Welcome to Bigger Than the Game with Deremy and Jose. I'm Deremy Dove, and today I'm joined by someone who I've had such a great time coming on his podcast. And we talked about a home and home, and he's going to be on. He's so great as a guest. He's going to be on our next two episodes back to back because he is our draft aficionado. He's a historian like Jose and I. He's got that love for it, and I'm just happy to have the host of the SNL Hall of Fame podcast, and he does a great job on his show. So please listen to his show, subscribe, like, all those things. But the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Thomas Sena, joining me. So Thomas, thanks for coming back on with me, man.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So nice that you're having me twice. I appreciate
Exactly.
I appreciate
Exactly.
that. Yeah, you've been on, so we had a great discussion on the SNL Hall of Fame podcast about Dick Ebersol, which
Right.
was fantastic. One of my favorite episodes that I've done. And you were on one of our roundtables talking about your
Yes.
selections for the SNL Hall of Fame. So we're all podcast partners and buddies at this
Exactly.
stage. So this is
Exactly.
good stuff. I'm a fan of your podcast. You and Jose do a
Thank you.
great job. I'm a listener and subscriber to Bigger Than the Game. So it's just wonderful to be here to chat with you.
No, and we appreciate you, man, and appreciate the support. And it's funny because I've heard from Lorne Michaels to other fans, other journalists, critics. They kind of compare SNL to a team, to a franchise, and building a team. Lauren, he's kind of like drafting his cast, drafting his writers, and seeing if he can get that championship product every Saturday night 11:30. And that's what, Lauren Michaels is that GM, is how I look at him for
Mhm.
SNL, and that's kind of what we're doing here a little bit. But we're looking back on a draft, and we're playing GM pretty much, and kind of looking and seeing what would have worked, what could have worked, what we should have seen, and all those things. So that's why I think the SNL Hall of Fame is very fun to do, because you can look back and be like, yeah, that was a great pick by Lauren, this writer or this cast member, and how he saw that they could fit onto the SNL family pretty much.
I'm always telling people that following SNL and being an SNL fan is almost exactly like being a sports fan.
Mm-hmm.
To me,
Mm-hmm.
like my favorite sports are baseball, basketball, football, and SNL.
Yes, yeah. I
those are
totally get
those are
that.
the sports that I follow. Those are the
I
four big
totally get
sports
that.
that I follow. I'm a hockey fan too, but like SNL is up there as far as like the sports that I follow, and I really do watch it that way. And you're right, like the draft, the NBA draft, and getting cast members, and then following the cast members and how they're doing on the show, and it is really like following players that you liked in the draft, and
Mm-hmm.
seeing how they're going to do in the NBA. So there's so many parallels to sports and SNL. I think it's a perfect match.
Absolutely, and it's fun because you can look at, oh man, well, I remember when Seth Meyers and Amy Poehler were on in '01, and I could see, I knew they were going to be something, or like, man, I had high hopes for this SNL cast member, and they let me down, and they didn't bring this guy. Or hey, it's a rebuilding year for SNL. Be
Hmm.
patient, trust the process. Which,
Yep.
being from Philly, I know all too well now. So a lot of times it's like, what's Lauren doing? What's NBC doing? And it's like, wait, you got to trust the process, hear him out. So it's a crazy comparison, man. You are so
Yeah.
right.
You got to
You're
trust
so
Lauren
right.
Hinkey and what
Yeah,
she's doing with the show.
yeah,
trust
yeah.
that trust that process. Yeah,
He,
and I
he,
think I think we're on an upswing as far as SNL goes, as far as like the cast and the prospects that we've seen join the show over the last few years, like maturing and actually turning it into a good show. That's
mm-hmm.
hilarious. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, he's either Lauren Hinkey, or he can some years have that Lauren Steinbrenner kind of feel where he's just getting these,
Yeah.
Melissa McCarthy, and Jim Carrey. He's
Mhm.
plucking them, Alec Baldwin. So he kind of goes back and forth which one he's going to be here. But
Exactly.
um, this is an interesting episode because, for, I think, the major drafts, we look at NFL and sports, we look at NBA, and there's a lot of them that we look back on in either sport, which were, this was a loaded draft, or this one that, people, it didn't pan out. But for the NBA draft, and the one that we're going to talk about, I think it's really unique in the fact that there's just so many things that have really haunted this draft. And we can point to other drafts that probably had less overall like talent as far as like what they did in the NBA. There's like quote unquote worst drafts, but this one, Thomas, this, and we're going to be talking about the '86 NBA draft. It almost has like a cursed kind of feel to it, you know?
It really does. It's part tragic. I mean, a lot of it is very tragic, and I don't think there hasn't been a draft possibly in the major drafts that people follow, like the NFL draft and NBA draft. I can't remember a draft that's like the '86 draft as far as just like what ifs and um, one very tragic story that we all know about that we're obviously going to talk about today, and just players. This was an interesting turning point as far as the NBA addressing certain off the court issues that they had to
Absolutely.
address.
Absolutely.
There were certain players in this draft that were the faces of that, and so it's very cursed, very snake bitten. All those are appropriate words for the 1986 draft.
Yeah. And something that, when we were talking about you coming on the show and what we wanted to talk about, you pointed out to me that despite all like the tragedy, there are some highlights, and also some certain franchises changed their fortune, two in particular, with this draft that kind of gets overlooked by a lot of NBA historians and draft fans like ourselves. So it has a mix. It's not all tragic. There's some positive that does come from it too.
Yeah, there's definitely positives. There's one franchise in particular drafted like three core players that turned him into a contender in the Eastern
Mm-hmm.
Conference. One drafted a player who almost, as far as culturally, with the Pistons, this player turned them, was one of the final pieces to elevate them to like a championship
Right.
level. So there were a lot of positives in this draft. I'm looking forward to talking about like the good things and the good players from this draft, along
Yes.
with some of the more snake bitten, more heartbreaking kind of things that happened in the '86 draft.
No, absolutely, man. So I think it's interesting, and for me, and we talked about it on the other episode that we did, where about you look at the top of the '86 draft and who originally has it. It's the Sixers and the Celtics, and teams who the Celtics are the defending world champions, arguably one of the best teams in NBA history, the '86 Celtics. And then you have the Sixers who won over like 50 games, and they're the top two picks. So it's still the beneficiary of a lot of these savvier GMs like Red Auerbach for the Celtics, Pat Williams at the time for the Sixers, taking advantage of the not so savvy that the Ted Sapiens and Donald Sterling gets involved later, but like owners like that who kind of just make these awful draft picks that even made David Stern say you got to stop. So when people look at it, like how these teams, and I know you know about it, Thomas, but how are the Sixers number one overall going into the draft, or the Celtics? It goes with a lot of these owners who are just making dumb decisions.
Yeah, in particular, the old Cleveland owner, Ted Stepien,
Yeah.
made some awful decisions. And we saw the Lakers were another team that was just such the beneficiary of this. In '79, they already had Kareem. They had the number one pick and drafted Magic Johnson. And in '82, they were coming up. They had already won a title with Magic Johnson and Kareem in 1980. They were a perennial championship team already. They got James Worthy, number one overall in '82
Right.
because of some taking advantage of some less savvy and owners, if you will. What's interesting to me too is so originally Philadelphia had the number one pick in the '86 draft. So we saw a turnabout where they actually got taken advantage of by the franchise that usually themselves got taken advantage of. So there was like a turnabout here, just with the number one pick.
Absolutely. And that's where it's bizarre. And I know for Philadelphia, the franchise, this draft looms over them to this day. And honestly, also you can say it looms over Charles Barkley's career in
Yeah.
Philadelphia, and he has said it even as of recent, like to the dismay that he's thinking he's getting Brad Daugherty, to join him, and instead they trade the pick and he's got Roy Hinson coming to join him, which
Mm-hmm.
still looks like it's one of the worst trades still in NBA history. Is this deal that the Sixers, and Harold Katz was the owner, but it's just a bizarre thing. And I want to know what you think, Thomas, of like just where this in your mind ranks with just worst trades, number one, but then number two, how does the Sixers and Barkley's fortune change if they stick with that pick and draft Brad Daugherty?
Well, now the Sixers got Roy Hinson and cash, Jeremy. So that's the big. No,
My fault. I forgot about the
yes,
cash.
the cash is the key there. No, so Roy
Yep.
Hinson, in Cleveland, that season he averaged almost 20 points a game. Good scorer. I guess the Philadelphia management didn't think that they could get a player who can put up that kind of production. There was the less sophisticated draft knowledge back then. Hinson, before I get into your question, he played 105 games in Philly, averaged about 13 points a game. He was just kind of your typical, almost replacement scorer.
Pretty
Honestly,
much.
like yeah, pretty much. Um, before, so I found an interesting note too that the reason Philly had this pick was because of a trade with the Clippers 7 years
Yep.
prior,
For
and that
for Jelly
involved
Bean.
Joe Jellybean, yeah, Joe Bryant. So Joe Bryant went to the Clippers in the trade. Philadelphia got, and I could see the Clippers thinking like, it's 7 years away.
Yep.
Who cares? Have our first round pick. We're gonna be champions by then. Clippers were not champions by then.
No.
Philadelphia had the number one pick, so that's why Philadelphia had that number one pick because they kind of took advantage of the Clippers. But it's interesting to your question, if Brad Daugherty is is a Sixer, so you're looking at Daugherty. Was it Moses Malone had already gone to Washington?
He goes event. They wind up trading him. Yeah, a little bit after
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, so
For
he's so Moses Malone's not there for the 86-87 season, right? He's in
right.
Washington. Okay. So they still have Maurice Cheeks, who's still a productive player. He's coming
Mm-hmm.
off of he's getting a little bit older, but he's still a good steady defender. At very least they have Chuck, who's getting into his prime. One last season of Doc, I guess, for veteran leadership. But I think
Mm-hmm.
Doherty, gosh, if you just pair Doherty and Charles Barkley, that changes the Sixers' fortunes because back then it was a big man's game. It
Right.
was a it was they were working from the post out, and not even a lot of times even out. It was just the post, and then I'm going to back you in, and we're
Mm-hmm.
going to score. So I think, gosh, Brad Daugherty, Charles Barkley, there's a chance that Charles Barkley, I mean, in a different timeline, doesn't end up in Phoenix if
Yeah.
if they just stand pat and take Brad Daugherty. So that has repercussions felt through the mid '90s maybe because Brad Daugherty ended up being what 4 or 5 time All-Star. I mean
Mm-hmm.
he was a
He
good
made.
he
Yeah.
was a good player. He lived up to the number one pick. But I definitely think that changes Philadelphia's fortunes and Sixers fans and Charles Barkley in particular have every right to be resentful of this trade.
Yeah. Yeah. It really loomed and really became a. You know, we find out. We kind of already finding out that Andrew Toney, his feet problems are really affecting him, and so it wound up becomes like just a dark time. And honestly, until you get Allen Iverson, this draft and that decision looms over the team for a decade, which I think is fascinating about the draft in all sports, but NBA is that these decisions, and a lot of times they're big ones, sometimes even these small ones, they can affect your franchise for a decade. Like these
Mhm.
kind of moves, like so, it's why the draft's so important.
Exactly. And you would ask like other trades, like where it stacks up with other bad trades. I immediately think of the Bucks drafting Dirk and then
Yep.
and there's there's not I don't think the Bucks were drafting Dirk to keep him and then all of a sudden Dallas said let's trade. That was probably a pick where the Bucks drafted him to be traded to Dallas.
Yeah.
So just like in '96, when the Hornets drafted, everybody says, "Oh, the Hornets drafted Kobe, and they made the mistake of trading." Well, they weren't going to keep Kobe, and Kobe wasn't
Right.
going to go to Charlotte. That pick was made so Kobe could go to the Lakers. So
Exactly.
that might have been that situation. But I mean, on the surface, the Dirk for Robert Traylor uh, trade is pretty unforgivable. Um, and that's like the probably the one uh, over the years that immediately comes to my mind. And this the Roy Hinson trade, we'll call
Yeah.
it now.
Yes. That's what it is. The Roy Hinson
This
trade.
uh, this looms large in Philadelphia. I mean, what the Sixers got for Charles Barkley wasn't that great, but at least they got Jeff Hornacek,
Mm-hmm.
who lasted maybe a year or whatever, but at least he was better than than Roy Hinson turned out to be,
Yeah.
regrettably.
Absolutely. And it just it it's one of those things that's just so bizarre. But I look at, even like we look at Brad Daugherty, and he kind of, as a really good first pick, he doesn't really get to the age of 30, before he's 8 years in, and his back is so bad he has to retire. So there's even a little bit of like what ifs or some tragedy around Brad Daugherty, but. I find it interesting because you go into the '86 draft, and we know what happened with Len Bias, 2 days later, tragically. But I look at just the fact that Brad Daugherty was the number one pick, and it seemed like there wasn't a lot of like debate. Like, he's number one over a Len Bias.
Mhm.
And Thomas, what I'm interested in is, we know when for so long the big man was king. But do you think, not don't look at what happened 2 days later, but if this is 5 years, even 10 years later, do you think Brad Daugherty still would have been the first pick over a Len Bias?
No, I think Len Bias would have been the first pick. The way the game was changing, because Len Bias was ahead of his time.
Yes.
Really, he was a very athletic wing. He had a good mid range jump shot, very marketable. Like, he would have been, I think, if Len Bias was in the NBA, we would have seen Len Bias in commercials and things of that nature. So his style was more conducive to what we started seeing probably in the mid '90s and beyond. So I think while Brad Daugherty obviously became a really good player and a perennial all star, I think just if you fast forwarded a decade later, Len Bias would have been the number one pick in the draft, and Doherty going two after him. And we saw a few players like Chuck Person got picked in this draft, and he probably would have stood pat because of his skill set translated to where the NBA
Right.
was going as well. But yeah, to your point, I think Len Bias in another generation, give it a few more years, and he probably would have been the number one pick.
Which kind of just amazes me, because it's kind of what was said, looking at '84 with MJ, and now you have an Olajuwon, and then you have a Sam Bowie, and it was like, definitely with those guys, and Olajuwon, all time great, but it was a height thing. But Len Bias was Michael Jordan, but he's 2-3 inches taller and bigger, like much bigger, and just diesel. And as good as Brad Daugherty was, I know he was a heck of a player at Carolina. No offense to him, no one talks about then or now Brad Daugherty at Carolina the way you still hear people then and now talking about Len Bias at Maryland. Like, he was on par the way they talked about MJ at Carolina. It was Len Bias at Maryland. That's just what baffles my mind. And MJ's already performing in the league at that time too. So I'm just kind of shocked that, like, why didn't Cleveland or Philly beforehand look at Len Bias as that number one pick?
Yeah, I agree with you. And even like as prospects, so you talked about there was already an archetype of what Len Bias could be with Michael Jordan, and to a certain extent, Clyde Drexler was already starting to show some signs
Right.
of
Mm-hmm.
becoming a star too. So you had those archetypes of what Len Bias could be, and as you said, in a couple inches taller
Yeah.
frame. And Brad Daugherty is a prospect. To my knowledge, he wasn't like, because the year prior, Patrick Ewing was the number one pick, and he
Right.
was like the next Bill Russell. That's
Yeah.
the type of prospect what he was talked about in those terms. Olajuwon the year before in '84 was talked about more so in those terms. Ralph Sampson was the next big thing in '83. So you had these drafts where the big man reigned and all these big men were getting hyped. But I don't think Brad Daugherty, as a prospect at the time, was considered on that level of prospect like Olajuwon or Ewing. So, and then the next year, it's kind of funny because we see this run of big man, and even in '87, David Robinson was the first pick, and he
Right.
was thought to be like in the Ewing, Bill Russell mold. And then you have Brad Daugherty, and I don't think Brad Daugherty as a prospect was thought to be that. So it does baffle me to this day that Len Bias wasn't the first pick. James Worthy is another example of a Len Bias kind of archetype, even though I think
Yeah.
Bias is more shifty, can maybe handle the ball a little bit more than Worthy. But we started seeing that archetype more. So I am baffled that, while Cleveland did make a great trade, sending Roy Hinson and cash to
Yeah.
Philadelphia. That's one thing.
Gotta have that cash.
Yes, guys, don't forget that cash. It does shock me then after they made that great trade that they didn't just take Len Bias.
Yeah, and obviously due to tragedy, it worked out for Cleveland, but I still think um, Ralph Sampson at seven, like the guys you named, it's a great job because Sampson, Olajuwon, Ewing, and then David Robinson, they were unicorn type guys in college. They were freaking nature guys.
Mhm.
Brad Daugherty was not that.
No.
And I think Brad Daugherty, even without the back injury, like he could have, which is a testament to him. I think he could have had a Hall of Fame career, like or been close because like he made an All NBA team. He was an All Star in a time of the big man, but he wasn't those kind of guys. He wasn't
No.
those. So I always, which I don't hear people talk about, is just kind of like, oh yeah, of course Brad Daugherty was one, and I'm thinking, why is it of course? Why isn't it of course Len Bias was the number one? That's just what always got me like, and and I think it kind of segues into the next point that I have, though. A question I want to bring up with you is we know what happens to tragedy 2 days later, that it happens to Len Bias and it gets other players that we'll get into. What do you think Len Bias's ceiling would have been if he does, he's number two with the Celtics, that are defending champs. What do you think the ceiling is for Len Bias? And then also, what do you think happens to that franchise if Len Bias plays for it?
Man, that's $1 million questions that even Celtics fans, especially, have been asking themselves since '86. I know. Bill Simmons brings this up like
Yeah.
once a week at least. And gosh, Len Bias, I think his ceiling was one of the two or three best players in the league in his prime. I don't think he would have. I don't think he would have eclipsed Jordan. I think Jordan. It was still would have been Jordan's league. But if you're looking at like the late '80s and early '90s, to be honest with you, once we started seeing guys like Bird's body broke down, Magic unfortunately had to retire young. We saw there wasn't a lot of new talent that that came in to replace them. All the great guys throughout most of the '90s were guys who were more veterans. So they were like Olajuwon, Jordan, Ewing, those types of guys. Robinson's one of the exceptions that came in and was a superstar. But when you look at the drafts after this, there wasn't a lot of new talent as much so as in other eras that got replenished. So I think there was a window there. There was an opportunity there for Len Bias then to have been like one of the faces of the league. So I could have seen him if all his talent came to fruition. It could have been Jordan and then like Len Bias. You know what I'm saying? And
Mm-hmm.
and
I
that's
agree.
the best case. And we of course we're big on the draft, and there's a chance that Len Bias wouldn't have lived up to that. There's a chance he would have been a bust for on the court reasons. Maybe his shot wouldn't have come along like people thought. Maybe, there's all these reasons why, but I think just potential wise, Len Bias could have been one of the three best players in the league throughout the '90s, honestly. It would have taken time because we saw Bird, when he got drafted, Bird was still an MVP. McHale was one of the best players in the league. But I think, maybe Reggie Lewis doesn't get the opportunity that he did. So maybe Bias replaces Reggie Lewis in the priorities the Celtics had.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I
No,
think Bias
absolutely.
could have. taken over once Bird's body totally broke down and Parrish and McHale got older, you know?
Yeah. I think Lynn Bias, well, as far as the player for me, I think at worst, just the way his game translated, I think he's a multiple time All Star. At like the lowest, he just made a few All Star games, which is still a heck of a career, in the
Yeah.
grand scheme of things. But I honestly think the way he was, and the way, and no disrespect to Larry Bird's still a top 10, some may say top 5 all time player. The small forward position was making a transition in the late 80s to a much more, you saw Scottie Pippen, Xavier McDaniel. It became much more athletic. And I think Len Bias would have been the blueprint of that. And he would have been the face of that. And I think Len Bias would have been, if he would have played and lived and played, I think we had the NBA 75th anniversary team. I think Len Bias makes that. I think he's there. I don't think I'm with you. I don't think he's MJ, but I think he's an all time great. He's a Hall of Famer, and he's at that NBA at 75 celebration.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And you brought up small forwards in that position, and no disrespect to this person, but somebody like Dan Marley made multiple All-Star games, right?
Right,
He was very good. He had his role, good shooter, good defender, slasher. But I think Len Bias probably would have been better than Dan Marley.
for sure.
And Marley made All-Star games. So,
Yeah,
you kind of look, and I know Marley played in the West for those, and Bias would have been in the East, but I think Len Bias at worst probably like would have made a couple of all-star games. Reggie Lewis ended up making I think one or two all-star games
hmm
before his untimely passing. So I agree with you as far as where you see where Len Bias would have fallen, and that's not like we probably sound like people who are romanticizing a certain player, a certain era, and everything. But you just go watch film and watch the way people talk about him, and it was hard to imagine that his style would have failed in the league.
yeah. It just doesn't. It like unless to me the only thing stopping him and the way he was, I remember listening to a podcast a few years ago. Brad Daugherty talking about how Len Bias was ahead of the curve on nutrition. He didn't put anything bad in his body. That he wasn't a drinker. That's what made the tragedy 2 nights later even crazier. Was like he wasn't a partier. He wasn't a guy who you're like, oh, watch out, Lynn. Like it was just like, man, just unbelievable, and to the point where there's a lot of conspiracy theory about what happened that night. And the thing is, we'll never know, and it's not for us to know. And the sad thing is, his parents lost a son, his siblings, they lost a brother. That's number one. But it's just like Len Bias was even ahead of the curve in that. So I think unless he was an injury, which he wasn't before, unless he was an injury prone guy in the league, there's no way he's not succeeding.
Right, and yeah, he obviously took care of his body. Like you just look at videos of him, and he had like he muscles before that was like a
Yeah,
common thing in
yeah,
in the league. Like he was defined, he was athletic. You can obviously tell that he trained properly. And yeah, no, I mean, there's only a handful of people who really know what happened that night. I mean, he was with maybe two other people, I think, most of the night, and I
yeah,
think a couple of his teammates came and went
yeah. They were in like
throughout
in and out.
throughout the
Yeah,
night. Yeah, like Keith Gatlin, I think maybe stopped by for a brief period of time and left. But there were only maybe a couple people who Len Bias was hanging out with that whole night. So no, we'll never know. And like you said, it's not necessarily for us to know. It's a tragic thing that happened. A family lost their kid, friends lost their friend, and on a wider scale, or I guess, or not probably on a lower scale, but just the sports world lost a potentially all-time great, and then Len Bias lost the opportunity to fulfill his potential and live out his like dream of playing the NBA. So
yeah. And this, just to highlight it for those who don't either they don't remember, or those who weren't around, um, what this death did, it changed a lot when it came. It impacted sports on the court and all that, but it changed the whole kind of like it's a defining moment in the 80s, honestly, and
mhm.
how we look at the drug culture, the crack epidemic. and it's a defining moment in a lot of ways. And also, like, this was kind of building. The NBA had that problem of, it's too black, it's too much drugs in the '70s, and drugs had affected careers before. David Thompson's career,
Man.
Michael Ray
Spencer
Richardson,
Haywood, Michael
Spencer Haywood.
Yeah.
Yeah, Richardson got banned in
Yep.
'84, but this kind of was the culmination of a lot of that for the league, and a lot of people used his death for better and for worse to kind of a lot of the drug policies we wind up seeing and different things like that. So this had an impact on the nation, and a lot of people of that era, they remember where they were when they heard Len Bias's death.
Yeah, definitely. And you're right, culturally, not just in basketball, because we know about basketball. Like David Thompson to me was like one of the big what ifs in the NBA. He ended up having a good career as it was. I mean, he was an all-star or whatever, but drugs definitely derailed David Thompson. He could have been up there, like you said, 75th anniversary, like David Thompson
Right,
should be
right.
up there if things played out like they should have. Michael Ray Richardson. So we knew that was a problem. Michael Jordan alluded to it. I just rewatched The Last Dance. Uh,
Oh, right, right.
yeah, and Michael Jordan alluded to that some of his teammates. You could go look at the roster and speculate as to who he was talking about. I'm not really going to do that here, but
Yeah.
I think a couple of those guys were kind of known to be into
Mm-hmm.
cocaine and partying and stuff, and that was just the thing. It was a thing in the society too.
Mm-hmm.
In the '80s, that's kind of what people started doing, and I think you're right. Like this was a big turning point as far as the NBA getting serious about a lot of its drug problems and society as a whole. I think it scared the crap out of people. It probably scared a lot of people out of even trying cocaine, trying
Mm-hmm.
things like that. I know, I was only 4 years old when Len Bias passed away, so I heard the story after the fact.
Yeah.
It even scared me as a kid, like of wanting to try stuff like that. I've never tried coke in
Yes.
my life. I've never been a drug user, partier much, or things like that. And that Len Bias story scared because I found out he didn't do a lot of cocaine. Like as far as I knew, that was his first time, first night
That's
he
what I,
tried it.
right.
So yeah, you're right. I mean, it had an impact. I guess that was a good impact that it had on people, was waking people up and scaring people out of doing a drug like that.
No, no, and you're right, and that's a good point you brought up. That a lot of times my family used that as the example of like, hey, one time Len Bias did it, like, he did it once and he died, so you never know when you do. And you're absolutely right. That had a fear in the back of my mind. Well, like, hey, Len Bias, like, I do it one time, that could be it for me, like, and it kind of loomed. And I never really tried it because it was like I'm like that's my luck is
Yeah,
one time and I'm gone. So like
exactly.
you're right. It did kind of loom there for a while.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there were a couple of people, at least in this draft, who didn't take that as a cautionary tale
Yeah.
against cocaine, and that's part of what makes this draft so unfortunate and cursed and snake bitten is we talked about Len Bias, but there are a few people in this draft who should have taken that as a wake up call. What happened to their fellow draft classmate, and they did not.
And they're all in the top 10,
Yeah.
Chris Washburn,
Hmm.
William Bedford, Roy Tarpley.
Yep.
Washburn was third to the Warriors, Bedford sixth to Phoenix, and Roy Tarpley got, the Mavericks from Cleveland, from good old Ted. He was seventh. So, but those guys, so, you have four of your top 10 affected and by drugs and one leading to a death and the other
Yeah.
people getting banned from the league and it affecting them careers and after their careers. I think Chris Washburn was one who people kind of, if you look back, there was trouble with him at North Carolina State,
Mhm.
and Jimmy V was coaching him, and some of the other guys. They're a little. It's sad, but not as surprising as what happened with Len Bias.
Right, right. Chris Washburn, in particular, he did have. There were some known stuff that he had some trouble at NC State. He actually checked into rehab during his rookie season in the NBA, so
Yeah.
that hit quick for Chris Washburn. And he was the type of player that Washburn was. Just to put him in context, we're talking about like how in the mid 80s the big man was valued,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like height. Washburn was 6'11" and pretty like an athletic frame. And a lot of him was a lot of potential because he was a big man who could move, and he only played 72 games in his career in the NBA. He checked into rehab like his rookie season. It was because of cocaine. He had a cocaine issue, and I don't see with him. I don't think as a player he would have lived up to the number 3 pick.
No,
It
I
didn't
agree.
seem like he would have been to that level. I don't think he would have been as good as Brad Doherty, Chuck Person, kind of players like that. But that was one where teams probably should have taken more seriously what was thought about him prior to the draft. And unfortunately, he didn't look at what happened to Len Bias and say, I need to get my act together and stop doing this coke. And
Mm-mm.
they sent him to rehab, and then a few years later got a lifetime ban from the NBA. He failed 3 drug tests, and that was it for him.
Yeah, and it was bad enough that one of David Stern's early on his first acts of as commissioner in '84 was he banned sugar. Michael Ray Richardson
Yeah.
for the time banned for life, and uh, and I think that's something to me that I like to point out to people is, and I wanted to hear what you thought about this point. You look at it, this disease of addiction, it hits every culture, it hits every economic, gender, faith, whatever you want to look at it, it hits anybody. There's no, oh, you got to be one of them to get it. No, everyone gets affected by it. If you're not affected, I think it's hard to find someone who doesn't at least know someone who has battled this disease, once you get to a certain age. But I part of me thought about it in getting ready for this is that looking at come like how does one class get so much tragedy with addiction, and just go with me. I want to see what you think. In college basketball, that kind of it was popular, but from the '79 title game with Bird and Magic, it kind of blew up. And then you get the Big East, ESPN. In college basketball, March Madness becomes this big event, and a lot of that money, that attention is going to these universities. Coaches are becoming stars. Players are now on cable. They're becoming stars. And do you think, not that it's the whole factor because it was building in society, but how much of a factor do you think that comes into where now at college basketball, you're like a superstar
Right.
and you're getting that attention like the pros do, which you didn't really have before until like the 80s. And that kind of affecting these young men, at the time.
Well, I can see that. I mean, we've seen throughout sports history, there's a too much too soon kind of thing that tends to affect a lot of athletes. We saw that. I mean, I just alluded to the dearth of talent that we that was in the NBA around the early 90s. A lot of those guys didn't live up to their potential because it was like too much too soon
Right.
kind of thing. Like we're talking about like Derek Coleman and those kind of players who really did have too much too soon, and they didn't quite fulfill their potential. And I think that could happen. I think that's a really interesting point that um, from 1979 on through the 80s, there was just so much attention, so much new attention given
Yeah.
to college basketball. It's possible that like the UCLA dynasty kind of put people to sleep a little bit
Mm-hmm.
and just made them like, oh yeah, it's a foregone conclusion that UCLA is going to win. And then we started getting these new teams in the late 70s, and by the 80s, college basketball was like this brand, and you started
Right.
seeing like the Georgetown teams getting attention, and Houston, the Phi Slamma Jamma getting attention. So I think that could be a big part of it. You're not just a student athlete now; you're going to play, and you're more of a star. You're more of a superstar, and sometimes
Yeah.
it's hard to handle for a lot of people. Is that attention, fame, probably money, more money given to players underneath the table, drugs, obviously, given to
Mm-hmm.
players underneath the table. So I think that's a really interesting point, Jeremy.
Yeah, because I just look at it like nationally in the '70s, right? Like who was a college player who was known ever? Bill Walton, because
Maybe
usually
Bill
like you said,
Walton. Yeah.
UCL, but like a lot of other great players, it's like they're more regional. Like the Carolina guys, they're known in the South for the ACC and stuff, but if you're out in the West Coast, do you really know like Phil Ford? Like you don't really know him,
Right.
like or Bobby Jones at that time. But then in the '80s with cable and ESPN, everyone, Jim Boeheim talks about like he'd go to California and they're like, oh yeah, you coached Pearl. I see you on the Big East and everything like that. They weren't used to that. Like that
Mhm.
became a big time thing, and I think I just kind of wonder how much that Len Bias was known. Like people knew who he
Absolutely.
was. 10 years earlier, he's known in like the South. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Right. And Washburn played in a college basketball hub. He played
Mm-hmm.
in the Raleigh. So he played near like Durham with Duke and Chapel Hill
Yep.
in North Carolina. Yeah, he played in that area, and can imagine how much attention he was
Right.
getting. And NC State was coming off a title.
Yeah.
Washburn got to NC State a year after they had won that championship, so they were still a brand. NC State was still kind of a brand in college basketball. They won a title. Valvano was like this flashy coach who got a lot of attention. So I can imagine Washburn was supposed to be like NC State's next big thing. But I can imagine with him specifically too, it was probably a lot for him and his personality.
Yeah. Yeah. We have Roy Tarpley, who
Yeah.
I think. Look at Tarpley and Bedford real quick. What do you think about those two guys as far as their potential if they had stayed more on the straight and narrow?
Well, so Bedford was the sixth pick. The Suns drafted him sixth overall, and then Roy Tarpley went seventh to the Mavs. So with Bedford, I don't know that there was a lot there as far as just what player he could have been. Even at Memphis, he wasn't like an All American. He played on good Memphis teams, and they're in the mid '80s, but I just didn't see a path for William Bedford to be like this great player. Substance abuse stuff did him in almost entirely, pretty quickly. He missed an entire season because of his issues. The 88-89 season, Bedford was just gone. He's an NBA champion. He was on the 1990 Pistons as like a played 6 minutes a game, but he was like an NBA champion. But I think his destiny probably was as like a big man off the bench.
Yeah.
Maybe like he could have gotten to a Sam Bowie level, and Bowie was a decent player, which Bedford maybe could have been, but I didn't see much with Bedford. An odd record that William Bedford holds. I
What's
don't know
that?
if you found the same thing. So William Bedford holds the record for fewest minutes played in a game with three or more 3-pointers made.
Yeah, well, I did. You're right. That
Okay.
is coming
Yeah,
back.
he was a
Yeah.
big man. He wasn't a shooter, but he went 3 for 3 in 1 minute when he was with the Pistons in a game in 1990. So Bedford actually holds a really obscure NBA record, but I don't think he would have been some star or anything
Okay.
like that. A
So
serviceable big man off the bench, a Sam Bowie, maybe Benoit Benjamin type of guy, but I didn't see much for him. Roy Tarpley, though, we can really get into. But I don't know
yeah.
if you had any thoughts on Bedford.
No, I thought that Dallas Maverick team of like the late '80s. They got to some conference finals. They're only Showtime Lakers were in their way with Derek Harper and Mark Aguirre. Sam Perkins is there, and Roy Tarpley. And Roy, I feel like really could have been something if he had stayed
Yeah.
more on that path.
Gosh. Aside from Len Bias, I think Tarpley is the biggest tragic story from this draft. Like the big, like as far as wasted potential, because we
Yeah.
saw what Roy Tarpley could do. Like he made the All Rookie team. He was good right away. Showed flashes. Six Man of the Year, his second season in the league. He put up those were really good Dallas teams. You'd mentioned like Harper, Rolando Blackman, Mark
Yes.
Aguirre, Sam Perkins. Those were, I think, James Donaldson was a good big man on those teams. So,
Mm-hmm.
so Tarpley came off the bench. They ended up making the Western Conference Finals. He put up 16 and 13 in the Western Conference Finals against the Lakers. He averaged 16 and 13.
Yeah. Against the
He,
Showtime Lakers.
yeah, against the Showtime Lakers. Tarpley averaged 18 points and 13 rebounds a game in 17 playoff games that year. He was putting up 18 and 13 in a playoff run for the man. Like, he was going to be a cornerstone for those Mavericks, and it was all laid out for him. He was going to be like a, I don't want to invoke Moses Malone too liberally, but like Tarpley was damn near Moses Malone level, like just gifted rebounder. Honestly, like
Yeah.
he could have been maybe not the scorer that Moses was, but like Tarpley could have been a beast on the boards like that. But then like 6 games into the 89-90 season, he was arrested for a DUI and resisting arrest. Rested again, March of 1991. Was banned from the league for
In
violating
95, right?
drug policy. Well, he was banned from the league in 91.
91.
Yeah, but then he actually came back. He got reinstated and came back for the 94-95 season. And I vividly remember this. I was probably 11, 12 years. I was going on 12 years old, 13 actually at this point. So I was like full-fledged hardcore NBA fan at this point. And Roy Tarpley was 30, got reinstated into the league. He was gonna like, this is gonna be a redemption story. He averaged 12 points and 8 rebounds. Not bad for somebody who hadn't played in the league in 3-4 years, you know. But then
Absolutely.
what you just said, and this is one of the parts that makes it so tragic to me, is that he was banned again, right?
Yeah.
Like he came back, made this comeback, and then he gets banned again in '95 because he violated the terms of his aftercare program.
And
And
he wound up suing the league over the saying that they violated the Mavericks and the NBA violated the Americans with Disabilities Act.
ADA,
You know, so which is a and someone who worked in drug and alcohol myself, so like that is a serious, you know, and like and people do still to this day do it. You know, it had companies, I mean, like will violate it. So it's even interesting in that regard that I wonder how often you were hearing that at that
right.
time, not just in sports but
Yeah.
anywhere
It was
about
just new. The ADA was 5 years old
yeah.
at that point,
Mm-hmm.
so it was kind of a new thing to invoke in situations like that. David Stern was he lived up to his last name. He was Stern as a as a commissioner.
Yeah.
So yeah, he probably didn't. He had probably low tolerance for Roy Tarpley, and he was concerned about the image of the league.
And
And
I think he saw and to be honest, he knew the stigma was wrong, that it was racial, black, you know, and drug addict, and so there was that harsher. It wasn't sophisticated as much as we still have a long way to go, but we're better now. So he knew that as working in the league office and coming into it, they think it's too black and too drug, and people connect those together. They
yeah,
connect race and poverty with drugs, even though that's not the case
yeah,
then or now, but people do that. So I think that David Stern was very image heavy, and that's why, like you say, he lived up to that name. He was stern with it.
yeah. And he felt like, with Roy Tarpley, he said, we banned you, we gave you a second chance, and that was it for him. And I remember being sad. Like I knew Roy Tarpley's story at the time. Like I said, I was
Mm-hmm.
13 when he had his comeback season, and when I found out that he had been banned again, I was just like shaking my head, like, damn, that sucks. Because I think when he got himself more into NBA shape as the years went on, into his mid 30s, he could have been a really productive rebounder, a really, really
Absolutely.
good rebounder. I don't think he would have reached all star level necessarily at that point in his career, but I mean, we could have seen him in the late 90s into the early 2000s, still helping a team like a Kevin Willis, maybe a lesser
Right.
version of like a Kevin Willis, but
That's a
this
good
old vet
comparison.
who could have helped the team on the boards, like. So aside from Len Bias, I think Roy Tarpley is the one that just makes me shake my head the most, and it's just unfortunate.
And what's sad about that is that's four of your first top 10 picks in this
Seven.
draft.
We'll say it was four of
Oh,
the
we
first
had
seven.
four of
Like
the first
to
seven
hammer that
picks,
point home.
you know, which is
Yeah, like
insane.
Len Bias, Chris Washburn, William Bedford, and Roy Tarpley, all substance abuse issues one extent or the other. For your first top seven picks. Wow,
You know, and you're right, but the thing is too, there's more tragedy and more bad luck with this
sure.
draft, and there's the international flavor of tragedy and bad luck with Drazen, Petrovic, and Sabonis. One more than the other, obviously,
Yep.
but Petrovic and Sabonis, who at the time we know the international game really, and even in the '90s, as we were talking about before on another episode, it was like, oh, what? Like the European game? Not sure. But in the '80s, it really had that effect. But these were guys who, if their bad luck and tragedy didn't hit them, they really could have changed that thinking a lot earlier than like Dirk did in '98.
Yeah, I think Petrovic was on his way to changing the narrative with international
Mm-hmm.
players, especially. We could get to Sabonis, but Petrovic is completely interesting to me because he was beloved in the NBA as an international player, and that didn't happen. He was one of the more beloved international players that I could ever remember from those early years,
Yeah.
right? And because he was this sharpshooter, he had this game that like appealed to Americans
Right.
and what we like to watch. He almost reminded me of like a prototype of Klay Thompson, and just in the way he moved and his shooting form. Maybe Petrovic was a little more shifty in his game,
Yeah.
but
Give a little more. Yeah.
yeah, but he was almost reminded me of like a little bit of like Klay Thompson
I think that. I think
type.
Drazen was a better defender than people
Yeah,
remember. Not as good as what Clay was as a defender, but Drazen could play some defense, and Drazen was a little more to people didn't realize, which I think, like you said, is why he appealed to players. Players respected him, and fans. He talked a little more trash. He had a little more street, a little more flavor to him than what people associated with the European game. But he tragically dies in '93, and he didn't go to an All Star game, but was on an All NBA team.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, and he's someone who was drafted in '86 by Portland, but took some time, didn't really pan out there, but wound up going to the Nets. And I think a lot of people remember him on those teams with Derek Coleman and Kenny Anderson.
Mhm.
And those Nets teams, for that little run, they were fun to watch.
Yeah.
Um, and Drazen was a big reason why. A lot of people wonder what would have happened to him if he would have lived and not had that tragic accident.
Yeah, he could have taken the mantle because the shooting guard depth around that time wasn't the best. I mean, of course, Jordan was like leaps and bounds better than any other player, much less shooting guard
Yeah,
in the league. And then you had like Mitch Richmond, Reggie
Reggie.
Miller,
Yeah,
but Petrovic could have been up there with them with that second tier at that position, definitely.
and I think he could. I think and Reggie, I go back and forth on. I think he would have been better than Reggie Miller. Mitch Richmond, I feel like is very underrated. How good he was, what he could do, but I think Drazen could have been better than both of them. I think, yeah, that number two shooting guards, overall, especially in the Eastern Conference, All
Yeah,
Star
we're
games.
forgetting Clyde Drexler, I think, but a little bit, but even around that time, Clyde started slowing
But to
down.
say he was slowing down,
Yeah,
when Drazen was emerging in the '90s,
yeah,
Clyde kind of like after like '92, Clyde's
mhm,
kind of going down. He's still productive, but
yep,
he's not the Clyde of the '80s and the early '90s in Portland.
yeah,
So I think Drazen could have really, and he was someone who, like, I think you said it, like, there's certain players you can look at and think, did they play before their time? Were they too late or at the right time? Drazen was like ahead of his time in what he was doing.
yeah. I think so. And he got attention when he was in Portland because he was like a decent bench player for a team that went to the finals that ended up
Right.
losing to Detroit. So Drazen actually had like a decent role on that Portland team. A lot of people forget, they think of Clyde and Terry Porter and those guys, but Drazen was like an important part of a finals team in Portland. And then I
Mm-hmm.
think the Nets wisely probably saw a lot of potential in that and scooped him up, and he ended up having his best years in New Jersey. But that's like a serious what if,
Yeah.
definitely on the international side from that draft.
It's right up there. Bias and him. Those are the ultimate like sad
Yeah.
stories with passing. And
Hmm.
Willis Reed passed away not too long ago, and with a lot of the tributes were coming out, I had forgotten that he was like an executive of those Nets teams, and a lot of people say that took the wind out of him
Wow.
when Drazen died. Just he had affection for as a person, but also what they were trying to build in New Jersey. When Drazen died, that kind of was the end of Willis. as far as his NBA career being an executive.
Yeah, and then that I don't think that team had good guidance. Like I think Chuck Daly ended his
Mm-hmm.
career as a coach there, and he was on kind of on his way out. He probably was getting a little worn down of being an NBA coach. And Derek Coleman didn't quite have the personality of a
No,
leader
and Kenny
necessarily. I don't
Anderson
think
didn't
Kenny
either.
Anderson did either. Yeah, so maybe I don't know. Like I can't speak to Drazen Petrovic's personality necessarily, but maybe he could have been like a more stabilizing presence with those Nets teams had he lived.
Especially bridging the gap. Remember, they get Calipari as a coach, and then you have those teams which were kind of fun. They didn't go deep in the playoffs, but with Kendall Gill and Kerry Kittles and all the Van Horn was there.
Yeah,
So like,
Sam
who knows?
Cassell. Yeah,
Yeah,
that was those were fun. I remember the famous. It was a famous Slam magazine cover that said "Nets champions by 2002. Count on it," and it had
yeah.
them on the cover of Slam magazine predicting that they were going to be champions. So yeah, I think the Nets could have been a more stable organization, obviously throughout the '90s,
If
if that didn't
Drazen would have lived.
happen. Yeah,
And we have to look, and especially it's crazy because of the Nuggets winning and all people talking about Joker,
Mhm.
but Sabonis is drafted also, Arvydas Sabonis in this draft, and I don't know if you watch what Sabonis was doing, you watched Olympic play and him against the Americans. Arvydas Sabonis is a freak of nature, and I could be off. Maybe it's a better. I think what we see with Joker, I think that was Sabonis back in the '80s, honestly, and
yeah.
honestly more exciting.
I was gonna say I think Sabonis was more athletic too because
Yeah,
you would see him in transition dunking on people, getting put back dunks, and I think Sabonis was a little more exciting. He would have a flair with his passes, and I know Jokic does too. But I think that's a he. I'm not saying, and I'm not saying this to say that Sabonis would have been like a two-time MVP and a champion and everything like that. But you can see when watching Jokic and then watching earlier video of Sabonis, how those are like apt comparisons. People were calling Sabonis a more athletic Bill Walton,
right.
and Sabonis was what like a late first round pick in this '86 draft. Also by Portland. Portland actually was like they seemed like one of the few teams who at least tried to scout internationally around this
Right.
time. Yeah,
They were a little ahead of the curve.
a
The
little bit.
Portland was. They were
Yeah,
trying.
but I think
Um,
Sabonis would have been an All Star in his prime and probably All NBA. But it was to stiff competition. He would have been playing at the same time as like Hakeem and Patrick Ewing and those guys. But he was every bit as talented probably as
yeah,
some of those guys. And we even saw old Sabonis in Portland. He was still good.
still hitting those threes and bringing Shaq
Passes and
outside the paint and
yeah,
everything.
still very
Um,
productive. And
I oh,
yeah,
go ahead, go ahead.
so that was just if that was just a glimpse of what he could have been in his prime. I think he could have been something special because he was in Portland. He was still like putting up 15 points and almost 10 rebounds a game when he was just like on half a leg at that
I
point.
mean, let's. I have two things for you. So let's look at it. We know that. So with Sabonis, it was the political climate, Cold War, all those things, and then when he finally comes in the '90s, he's older, injured, not as athletic. Like you said, still putting up. But if Portland gets Sabonis, even after a couple, say he comes in '88, do you think Detroit has one less championship, or the Bulls have one less championship if if Sabonis is on those Blazers teams?
I don't know that the Bulls do. Um, I think maybe Detroit. I think maybe if Sabonis, but by 1990 he was still. I think he started breaking down 90-91, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
or 91, 92, one of those early '90s years.
But in 1990, he was still. We had seen him a couple years prior in the Olympics, like still move well and lead them to gold against the Americans. And so in 1990 Sabonis, I can't see as tough as like John Sally and Mahorn and James Edwards and those guys were. I it would have been hard to do something with Sabonis, and then that would have opened stuff up for Clyde, obviously, and I think it would have brought out the best in Terry Porter. Maybe a reduced role for Kevin Duckworth,
Yeah,
but prime Sabonis is better than prime Kevin Duckworth. No offense to Kevin Duckworth, but yeah, I think at least would have maybe like I could have seen them take Detroit to 7. That series ended in 5 in 1990, but I think
Mm-hmm.
they would have like been on the precipice of a championship more so than just kind of getting like gentlemen swept by Detroit.
Yeah, no, and I say that because I think that would have been because you made a great point. In that era, if he comes over of centers, it's hard to stick up out above them. Like when you have a Ewing, Robinson, Olajuwon, Shaq comes in '92, but the big man, we say Brad Darty's there. Like it's kind of hard to, Kareem is older but still playing. It'd be hard, but I think that the way like Bill Walton, what he did in '77 and how he stood out there, I think that could have been Sabonis's way. Like, you know what I mean? Where he's helping get his team to titles. And then now we're really raving about him in the world of analytics. And then we can watch him and we're like, look at the passes he made. I feel like his legacy would have grown even greater now if he played in the NBA.
Yeah, just one of the great players that we never got to see in the NBA in his prime. That's like a huge what if. I think he could have had like a slight mental edge on David Robinson
Bro, for sure.
from the '88 Olympics. I think maybe
Absolutely.
Sabonis could have felt that he like had some sort of competitive and mental edge on David Robinson when Robinson came into the league. He would have looked at me like, "I beat you in the Olympics." So maybe he would have felt like superior and in higher standing than even the Admiral, like
Oh,
in
man.
those years. That's an incredible what if.
Well, I want to see what you think about it because I look at the 1986 NBA draft and I think for top 5 what ifs in NBA history, I think we have 3 of them
Mhm.
in this draft. And I don't know if you think they're that high or that lower, but I really think we can look at this between bias, Sabonis, and and Petrovic of 3 of the top 5 biggest what ifs in NBA history. Like what could have been all in one draft, I feel.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, Greg Oden definitely comes to mind. There's guys like there's so many like in the early '70s that like Bob Rule. I don't know if anybody remembers the name Bob Rule. He was an old
Mm-hmm.
Sonic from back in the day. We mentioned David Thompson. And some of the Toby Knight from the Knicks, Ernie DiGregorio from Buffalo. There's like all these like what ifs, but I think I would definitely put Len Bias up there. Definitely Sabonis. I think Drazen is knocking at the door of like those all
Yeah,
time what ifs because we actually got
Drazen,
to see Drazen as an All
right.
NBA player in the league, and that's maybe some in some ways even more frustrating.
Right, absolutely. And I think Drazen would be the one that you want to knock off. But if I'm looking at it, Thomas, Connie Hawkins is
Yeah,
in there. Bill Walton,
Bill Walton,
and what if he could have been healthy, what that would have done. And
Brandon Roy comes to mind too.
they do.
Yeah,
But I probably put them below Brandon Roy, Reggie Lewis. Um,
people say
uh,
McGrady, but I think he was too good, and we saw enough of him not to be like a what if kind of guy.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I think McGrady he did his thing.
yeah,
Like um, now, some may say Penny and Grant Hill.
yeah, yeah, right.
You know, but they did have success. Penny really was short.
But we
Um,
actually saw them be able to become all NBA players. Like with Len Bias, obviously we never even got to see him play a game in the NBA. Sabonis, we got old rundown Sabonis,
yeah, his whole prime was
who was
gone.
still a good player.
Right.
So I would put Sabonis and Len Bias like really up there.
Yeah, it's just crazy because there's so many drafts, and I know you mentioned before like Bill Simmons, and so I know you probably watch those things where he'll look at an '84 draft and all these probabilities and what ifs could have happened if this would have, and that's fun to do. I don't think they compare to what '86 could have been and the what ifs and the tragic and all this happened, like just all these different scenarios because even Brad Daugherty, the first pick, is like a sad story in a way
Mhm.
with what happened to him, like retired before he hits the age of 30. Like it's just insane. Like
Yeah. He ended up
all those things.
being a NASCAR guy
Yeah,
after that. That was kind of his second passion. But I do these as an NBA draft nerd. I've done these redrafts. So I have like an Excel sheet, and in each column I have a different year, and then I just kind of went through and like re-ranked them. And for
right.
the 86 draft, we talk about how tragic some of these are. But like with Sabonis, I would still put him like seventh on a redraft just for his time in Portland when he actually did play. That's how like good he was. If you did a redraft and we got to see Sabonis in his prime, there's a good chance he's first. Him and Len Bias, they could
Or
actually
battling out
go to
for it.
battling it out for the two best players from the 86 draft.
Absolutely.
I still have Petrovic eighth in a redraft. Like
Yeah.
he's just the short amount of time we had him, he's still a worthy top 8 player from that draft and climbing. I think he would have ended up eclipsing probably Jeff Hornacek, maybe like Mark Price up in that range. So Petrovic could have been. I mean, there's a chance. I don't know if Petrovic would have eclipsed Brad Daugherty necessarily, but there's a chance you could have seen Bias, Sabonis, and Petrovic as like the 3 best players from that draft that we never got to see.
Never really got to see like really do any like in their prime. Bias never at all, and Petrovic and Sabonis we didn't get their primes.
Right.
For me, last question on the international side: if these guys with if Sabonis plays, he just comes over. That's pre Dream Team, and Petrovic's best year was after the Dream Team. How did we always kind of give the Dream Team credit for the international boom? Do you think that changes if we get prime Sabonis and Drazen is already here and playing? Like, do we look at like the impact of the Dream Team, like still big? Don't get me wrong, but differently because before then we didn't really. Sabonis doesn't come over. Drazen hasn't emerged yet, but like, does that kind of change like their legacy? I think their legacy like changes. Maybe I want to see what you think if we get them before.
Yeah, I think the dream team was still important to push it over the edge. I think you needed the dream team at basically as that catalyst to really push it over. I think the international ball it would have been a little more popular. You had Sarunas Marshallonis
Yeah,
as well. We talk about like those Run TMC teams of like Mullen and Hardaway and Richmond
Mitch. Yeah,
are talked about highly, but Sarunas Marshallonis was like the fourth guy
yeah,
on those Warriors teams, and he was exciting. Like he was like pre Ginobili kind of like exciting brand
great comparison
of basketball, and I think
and
guys like
tough.
and tough, yeah, Marshallonis, and that's what we figured out pretty quickly. Is a lot of those Eastern European guys were super tough.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about Petrovic talking trash, and he was a tough guy. Sabonis was pretty tough. So I think it would have helped, but I think we still needed the dream team to push it over and make it what it actually was. But I think we would have had. I think on the United States side, I think we would have had more respect for the international game earlier on. So I maybe think it
Yeah.
would have been reverse, where it would have opened our eyes a lot
Okay.
quicker if a prime Sabonis would have come over and did what he probably would have and could have done. I think it would have opened the eyes of American basketball fans a lot more quickly. It took honestly, it probably took like Dirk Nowitzki to really do that.
Right. And that's where I think like for me, I think like the Dream Team is the big, and I think you're right that pushed it, but their legacies would have been so huge. Like the way to me, Dirk's legacy is great because of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's funny, and that shows. And I'm not passing the buck. It's me too. The arrogant American, where it's like I look back, how dumb were we? These guys grew up in war torn countries,
Right.
and they're dealing with civil wars and just all these issues, and we're calling them soft. Like I just
Right.
think like how arrogant looking
Exactly.
back that is.
You're just playing into stereotypes. That's
Mm-hmm.
kind of that's really all that was. But you're right. Like we should have looked at the backgrounds and kind of the what a lot of these guys had to deal with growing up, and been like, yeah, they're pretty damn tough.
Yeah, to survive war torn,
Yeah.
civil wars, and you don't know what's going on, brother against brother, and everything's being torn apart, and it's like, oh, those guys are soft. They're not tough, and it's like that's
Yeah.
it's like I look back, I go, "What the hell were we thinking?" But that's us a lot of times. But no, I also look at it, and I'm glad you had brought this up when we were talking about this before the show. Looking at there are teams who had success, and I thought of two. We mentioned two before, but honestly, you can maybe say a third in a way. They had some bad luck, but a third team drafted really well. Where you look at what Portland did because Kevin Duckworth is a part of
That's
this
right.
'86 class as well, and so Portland, it didn't work out for them. But hey, that scouting, you can't say that they had a bad draft in '86 at
Yeah.
all.
Two-time All-Star Kevin Duckworth, by the way.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
he was one of there were five All-Stars from the '86 draft. Kevin Duckworth was one of them. So you're right. Portland having a keen eye for international talent and getting Kevin Duckworth at number pick 33. They got Kevin Duckworth, so he ended up far exceeding that pick. So you're right. Portland did have a really nice draft.
but I want to look at. We'll start with Detroit first, and then we'll get to the other team. But looking at the Pistons, and it's funny. I've heard Dennis Rodman make this joke with John Sally that it should have been reversed. He should be the first. He should have been the first round pick, and John Sally should have been the second round. But the Pistons getting at the 11th pick, John Sally from Georgia Tech, and then in the second round, them going on and getting Dennis Rodman with the 27th pick
Mhm.
from Southeastern Oklahoma State. Those are really the final two pieces missing for the Bad Boy Dynasty.
Yeah, yeah, right. And we had seen starting in '81. That's obviously when it started. They drafted Isaiah,
Mm-hmm.
and they started bringing in like Bill Laimbeer. They got him from Cleveland. I think they got Vinnie Johnson. He was already on the team a little
Yeah.
bit early, so they started kind of racking up these pieces. They got Joe Dumars in the '85 draft at pick 18, so that was like an astute pick from
Mm-hmm.
them. So we saw this building. They had these good battles with the Knicks. They were putting maybe scares a little bit into like the Celtics, even though they weren't quite there yet. But you're right, like the Pistons finishing things off with getting John Sally at pick 11, and then Dennis Rodman, which was a great pick at number 27. He defensive player of the year. We all know Dennis Rodman. So this was like as far as culture and identity and what they wanted their team to be, getting Rodman and John Sally was like the one of the final pieces to the puzzle. I'm not sure when they got James Edwards. Maybe it was around this time too,
Yeah.
but those were like the final pieces as far as building their bad boys culture. Then they traded Dantley for Aguirre, and then things just really like they were
Right.
the bad boys Pistons after that. But yeah, this was like a really excellent turning point for the Pistons and for the Eastern Conference.
And I think without this draft, in my opinion, the Pistons aren't champions. As great as
Agreed.
Isaiah is and Joe, for what that cult, like you said, the culture, the identity of the team, and who they were, and the versatility of these guys. Sally even coming off the bench, but being a shot blocker and can run the floor and get putbacks and dunks, bringing energy. And then, like you said, we know Rodman, a defensive player of the year, could cover 1 through 5 almost out there on the
Mhm.
court. Thinking about him, Garden Bird, and then Garden Michael or Scotty later on, like how important that was to have there. Um, it's no shocker that after this draft, Rodman and Sally's rookie year, they're in the conference finals '87, finals in '88, lose a heartbreaker, world champs '89, world champs '90, and then conference finals they lose in '91. But you know, like you said, they were kind of like in first, second round
Mhm.
getting bumped, and then they became this title contending team with this draft.
They really found themselves. They found
Yeah.
such an identity, and I don't think it's a coincidence that they got especially Rodman, and then they found themselves almost in '87 gave the Celtics a battle. They needed like that Larry Bird steal, push
Exactly.
it to Dennis Johnson to like the Celtics needed almost needed that to like stave off the Pistons even then. So
Mm-hmm.
so it's just like culture is so important, we know, in sports and in basketball, and these two were like culture setters and damn good on the court too.
No, I think about a story I heard about Rodman when he showed up to like the Pistons camp, and people were like, he started, he was just like out working, and he's real, classic Dennis Rodman. He was real intense. And someone said, "Who are you?" And it's one of my favorite quotes. He said, "I'm nobody from nowhere." And I always love that because I'm like that. That was Dennis. Like he had nothing to lose. And
Mm-hmm.
to me, that's what I loved about watching, especially Detroit. There's nothing like watching Pistons Rodman, and he just played with that. Like, yeah, I got nothing to lose out here. No one expects anything. I'm a second round pick. You're the guys with all the attention and everything. You got all that. You care about image. I'm going to do the dirty work, and I'm getting it done.
Yeah.
And that was the key to the Pistons getting over that hump.
Yeah, definitely. So Detroit had you mentioned Portland, Detroit
But you
had a
mentioned the
nice draft.
team. You mentioned the team that
Mhm.
I had totally overlooked before you said it before we were recording.
Well, are we talking about Cleveland?
Yes, sir.
Cleveland had an awesome draft that propelled them to like almost. I mean, they gave the Bulls fits in the
Mm-hmm.
late '80s into the early &90s. They were like they never beat the Bulls, but they made it hard. They always gave them fits. They needed like Jordan to be Jordan
Yeah.
for to get past Cleveland, essentially. So we've mentioned Brad Daugherty, who Cleveland got with the first pick, ended up being a really great pick. Arguably, if you do a redraft, top maybe the first pick again, top two, three
Top
at
two.
worst.
Yeah.
So they got Brad Daugherty there with the first pick. His career was cut short, but he was still like a perennial All Star in Cleveland. Then with the eighth pick, they select Ron Harper from
Mm-hmm.
Miami of Ohio. This almost like we talked about how there was a certain prototype that was in the league already with Jordan and Drexler and those guys. Ron Harper fit that prototype. He was a
Absolutely.
rangy athlete, um, just really great scorer. He ended up averaging 22 points a game thereabouts his rookie season. So he was like Ron Harper was like people early on. People were looking at those Cleveland teams and thinking Ron Harper was the guy, right?
Right.
Out of all of them. So
Mm-hmm.
man, yeah, Ron Harper. So they got Brad Daugherty and Ron Harper, and then 25th Deremy. Who'd they get?
Yeah. Mr. Mark Price,
Yes.
who I don't know because ACC is getting popular, and Price and Spider Sally were a good combo there. And I don't know how, I know it's a big man game, and I besides just like bias against Mark Price being a slower white point guard,
Mhm.
I don't know how he falls to the second round in my opinion. And Mark Price, one of the un like underrated players of that era, and just how good he was, and how like innovative, honestly, into what we saw with Steve Nash and how people play the pick and roll. A big part of that is what Mark Price did in Cleveland, where like, hey, now you can't just give that. You got to come up. You got to fight through the script. Like people were playing the pick and roll different. You can look at it pre Mark Price in Cleveland and after. And Steve Kerr, I know he's given props in recent years to what Mark Price did in the game, but like a guy who gave people fits, and what a top guard of that time too.
Yeah, one of the best shooters of all time.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, like one of the 5 or 10 best shooters to ever play in the NBA. Like his free throw percentage, like he set the standard as far as free throw shooting. And if the 3 point shot was more emphasized when he played, I'm sure he would have cashed in on that too.
Yeah,
But yeah,
four-time All Star,
oh yeah, was he first team All NBA one year?
'93,
Too. Gosh, yeah, he went as high as first team All NBA.
and three-time All NBA third team.
Yeah, Mark Price. Well, he's one of those early '90s players that, for myself, growing up, like watching NBA inside stuff and following the NBA like I did, like we all knew about Mark Price. But I think as time has gone on, he's one of those guys that has slipped into the cracks of NBA history.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think, and the fact that he slipped to 25th, I think you did bring up a good point. I think he wasn't like you look at him, he's not a physically imposing guy. He was almost a cookie cutter white point guard in a lot of
Yeah,
ways. That's probably how people looked at him. And Stockton hadn't been in the league long enough to make people relearn those lessons,
exactly, exactly.
so
Well,
they saw Mark Price and was just like, all right, we know he was good in college, but how is this going to translate to the NBA? I'm sure that's what they were thinking.
and you're right, because you look at it. So he's in a big program. His teams were good at Tech. I believe they won an ACC tournament. Like they were ACC champs one of those years. But I also got to look at this. You look at this draft. Johnny Dawkins was picked, I believe, 10th.
Yep.
And if you watch um, the documentary, The Team That Saved Coach K, with that '86 Duke team, and they talk about how Dawkins, his big rival was Mark Price, and they would go at it. So to me, and Dawkins didn't have an impressive thing about Johnny Dawkins. His body wasn't, he was kind of really skinny, not that big, and he wound up being hurt a lot. I remember Jerry Krause, before he passed, talked about it. Like he wasn't impressed with his body. That's why he didn't like him.
Wasn't he supposed to be like a Jordan stopper or something? Like one of the early guys who they thought could guard Jordan well?
Somehow, some way,
He and
yeah.
Gerald Wilkins were the guys who I remember being talked
Yeah.
about. Like, oh, they're going to guard Jordan. Like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen.
No, they're not. It really, the guys in Cleveland, Ron Harper, or who they got.
Uh-huh.
He was the guy who, and no one can stop Jordan, but wound up being a guy who gave Jordan some tough times.
Yeah, definitely.
And like you mentioned, Dumars did too. But like, I look at it like, why take Dawkins 10th, but you take Mark Price 25?
Right.
And they're not that. Mark Price, better shooter. Neither one, not like Dawkins had an incredible body or was an incredible athlete, neither. So to me, it's just like, it's stigma. It's that white, we don't want, he's a white point guard. We don't want him. Yeah. And that's why he falls. And to Cleveland's benefit, they get a pretty much like a third all-star. They get 3 all-stars in one draft.
Yeah. Well, there's a player who was kind of cut in the Mark Price mold who was taken 22nd in this draft and outplayed that position, which is Scott Skiles.
Yeah.
So he probably should have been a higher pick. I think Skiles had a slightly better career than even Johnny Dawkins did in the league. He still holds the single game assist record.
Correct.
Skiles does, and he was a great scorer at Michigan State. He had like 27 a game at Michigan State. He was a little, I don't know if he rubbed people the wrong way in interviews. I could see that happen with Scott Skiles.
Yeah, he's a fiery personality.
Very fiery personality.
He's intense.
He's very intense. So he slipped to 22nd when he probably should have been a top 10.
To fight Shaq.
Yeah.
You got to be kind of not all there. Yeah, he got
definitely wasn't all there.
Yeah. So I think that's why he kind of struggled even in coaching. Mm-hmm. I think he's a tough personality. He's an intense guy. So I think that plays a factor in it. But
yeah,
I just look at it. I think that's why those guys fell. Probably. But you see a Johnny Dawkins going at 10. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and Dawkins was okay. I think injuries kind of stifled him.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't a bad player, but like. Yeah, definitely Mark Price was overlooked. And there's another guy who was overlooked, but probably because he wasn't like the best. Yeah, I think he was a late bloomer, and that was Jeff Hornacek.
Yes.
Who was very much a late bloomer. I think Phoenix got him with the 46th pick that year. So that might have been, I forget what the rounds were at the time, but that might have been like third round or late second round by then. But at Iowa State, his number didn't jump off the page.
No.
He was probably looked as a cookie cutter kind of guard too, and he definitely outplayed his 46th pick, and he's arguably like one of the 4 best players in the draft from that year. Just a lot.
He's up there.
Yeah, you just see scouting. I think just players who got overlooked then nowadays might not get overlooked so much.
Well, let me ask you, so like a little off course. A lot of times you'll hear things about these leagues, and we're on the NBA, but it's a copycat league. It's a cookie cutter league. Do you think? And I think you look at scouting, especially back then, it definitely was that. It was just like it wasn't as advanced, and and people And that's like a Jerry Krause stood out. He did other things. He didn't just go with the crowd. Do you think that still applies a lot now, where people kind of make, oh, this is the safe decision, or this is the copycat kind of answer? Do you think there's more unique individual thinking when it comes to evaluating and scouting players today?
I think there's less copycat as far as trying to find a prototype. I think
Mm-hmm.
around the mid to late 2000s that sort of dissipated because in the night we have talked about how people were looking for like a Jordan prototype.
Yeah.
So like Ron Harper even fell into that. So Ron Harper,
Mm-hmm.
Harold Miner, Jerry Stackhouse
Yep.
was like the Jordan prototypes, right? And then there was a time in the 90s where Scottie Pippen became a prototype. So this person's the next point forward. This is the next Scottie Pippen. Dirk
Mm-hmm.
Nowitzki became a prototype, and he 6'11", tall European guy who had a good
Yeah.
shooting stroke could be the next Dirk Nowitzki, right? I think that's been less and less. I think teams are looking less for like specific prototypes, but I think there's so much groupthink too.
Yeah.
And I think honestly think mock drafts and things of that nature kind of hurt or kind of they do sway uh opinions. So I think GMs might see if somebody's going high in mock drafts, but they don't really like them. Well, I'm going to take them anyway because my job is on the line and I can justify taking this person who has been top all the mock drafts, even if I'm not totally sold on them. So I think there might be copycat in that way, as far as like they see what experts or other teams think of a player, and that might sway them, even though they look at the player and be like, I'm not totally sold. But as
Mm-hmm.
far as just looking at prototypes, I think there's a little more independent thought than there used to be. Jerry Krause was a good example, and we didn't even mention Tony Kukoc. We had a whole international conversation, and Tony Kukoc wasn't brought up, but like that
Yeah.
was a savvy pick. And then he wasn't in this draft, but that was like a super savvy pick by Krause, and he was definitely an outside of the box thinker.
Yeah, and he stood out from that. And I think about Jerry Krause, and he's gotten mentioned on this podcast a lot. And he's someone in my mind a lot because of, you said you were rewatching The Last Dance, um, how he's portrayed. And in some things I understand, but other things he gets wrongly portrayed. But you see a lot of times it's groupthink. The Johnny Dawkins line, I got his last interview, Krause, before he died, was that podcast with Woj, and it's an amazing episode. And he talked about, he goes, I didn't like Johnny Dawkins' body. I
Yeah,
wasn't a fan of how he was built. He too skinny and he gets injured too much. And he talked about thinking outside the box, and he didn't want his other scouts, don't sit with other scouts and on other teams. Stay to yourself, because I want original thought. And I think about it because he looked at 87, what he did, and that's like,
hmm,
getting Pippen and Grant, right?
yeah,
Like, that's huge, and that's one of the all-time great drafts for any teams, getting those two guys and
right.
building a dynasty. But there's other example. The year before, Detroit did finish their cap off a dynasty, like with Rodman and Sally, and this Cleveland team, you know, did a hell of a draft in '86.
Yeah, they did that, and then they topped it off. They ended up getting they traded away Kevin Johnson, but Larry Nance was probably more of a smooth fit at the time. So
Mm-hmm.
Cleveland traded away Kevin Johnson, got Larry Nance, and that was almost the final piece of like, now we're legit. Like now we can actually feel like we can compete in the Eastern Conference, and they almost did. Those Cleveland teams were like fun to watch. I remember Gerald
Yeah.
Wilkins was on one of those. Craig Elo, like that.
Hot Rod
Hot
Williams.
Rod Williams. Those were like fun teams to watch. I believe Hot Rod Williams was in this '86 draft as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of through some funky circumstance.
Well,
Like, I think,
he was a prop 48 at Tulane, and then there were some issues that ended up like sinking the Tulane basketball program maybe for a
yeah.
couple of years. But he had issues. He probably slipped in the draft because of that. But was so Hot Rod. Did we forget to mention Hot Rod Williams?
Yeah. Because
So
he's
that
kind of,
was wow. So that was for Cleveland. So we have um, no, Hot Rod Williams. Sorry, Hot Rod Williams was in the '85 draft. There was a different
right.
John Williams. It was Hot Plate Williams that was in the '86 draft.
Okay. Because Hot Rod, I think he didn't play in '85,
Right.
'86. So that's kind of why he's kind of part of that class, because
yeah,
the NBA does sports team. I don't like that. I think even if you miss a year, that year you're drafted, that's still your rookie year because you're with an NBA team. You got NBA coaching and training, and so. But technically, he's part of the '86 group because he didn't play
yeah,
that first year.
that's true. So, I got mixed up with
Hot
John
plate,
Hot Plate Williams
hot plate Williams.
from LSU, who was the 12th pick in the draft, and he actually I put him as like on my list of like other kind of interesting players because he was almost like a Robert Traylor, Oliver
Mm-hmm.
Miller type of
Yeah, yeah.
type of guy, and he was drafted by Washington and put up decent stats, but poor guy, like out of all the nicknames, so like there was another guy named John Williams who was called Hot Rod Williams, and you're a bigger guy named John Williams, like poor guy that to have a name that lends itself to like a demeaning nickname
Mm-hmm.
like they
Yeah.
gave him just because there was a Hot Rod Williams or
Yeah. It wouldn't have happened now.
God,
That's that '80s.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
But um, I want to also, before we finish, look at some of the notable players who were picked. And I know you have your redraft, like, so kind of like go through like how you see like, maybe your top picks of like if we're redrafting them, who's there, because this draft does have some notable players in it
Yeah.
too.
Definitely. So I wanted to run this by you too. So in terms of redrafting, and I'm curious as to what should be prioritized. So we have probably we have Dennis Rodman who had like the most notable career as far as championships and there's rebounding and all defensive teams, right? But if you drafted Dennis Rodman first, could you build a team around him,
Right. I
right?
was thinking the same thing. Yep.
So who do you pick first then in between Dennis Rodman and Brad Daugherty? Like,
I would I would still go with Brad because of
right.
that. I would still go with Brad Daugherty
So
first.
it's interesting. So if you make an all-time list of like greatest players, Dennis Rodman would be ahead of Brad Daugherty, right?
Right.
On that list. But if you're doing a redraft to try to build a team, Brad Daugherty probably goes before Dennis Rodman.
Because Rodman was a missing piece
Right.
for teams, and that rightfully so. He should get praise for that.
Yeah.
He was never ever going to be the anchor of a team like the way
No.
Brad Daugherty was,
Or
and
even
Brad
Mark Price.
or Mark Price.
Even though I probably would still at this point I would say Doherty number one, Rodman number two, just to give Rodman respect for what he achieved, right?
Yeah, I put Rodman over Price,
Yeah.
um, because Price's run wasn't as long either.
Yeah. And he had a pretty bad injury, Mark Price did in the early nineties. He missed almost an
Yeah.
entire year.
Hmm.
Too. So we'll do Doherty, Rodman, Mark Price, I think number three.
Yeah.
Jeff Hornacek, I would put number four.
Really
I would
over
put
a
it
Duckworth or
yeah. Over Ron Harper,
over
over some
Ron.
other. Yeah, that was a tough between Ron Harper and Hornacek, but I think Hornacek was a little more consistent. I know they played different roles on finals teams. They played against each other in the same couple finals, but I would have slightly Hornacek over Ron Harper, but I could be talked into having Ron Harper
I
ahead.
would maybe because I don't think Hornacek ever balled the way
Yeah, at their
Harper in
peaks.
Cleveland.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I
like
could be
Ron
talked
Harper could
into like,
ball.
yeah, Harper and then Hornacek. Chuck Person is actually like my
Hmm.
number six. And we didn't even talk about like out of all these players we talked about, we didn't mention Chuck Person. He won Rookie of the Year. He was
Yeah,
the Rookie of the Year from this draft.
you know what's
So
weird? He kind of always gets overshadowed because he played. I feel like because he played with Barkley and Auburn,
uh-huh.
so he kind of gets overlooked a lot. Like Chuck Person was a good player for a
Yeah.
while.
Yeah, he was really good. The rifleman. I definitely remember him from my childhood.
Yeah.
When we've talked about Sabonis and Petrovic, I think they can slide in after Chuck Person, and then the father of one of the arguably
Yes.
10 best players of all time, Del Curry, was in this draft. He was
Absolutely.
15th, and I kind of have him like borderline. I have him ninth because he was like he was one of the best shooters in the league.
Mm-hmm.
Reliable
It was
player for those
for a
Hornets
while.
teams for a while. So
Had a
I think,
long career.
yeah, Del Curry in the '86 draft from Virginia Tech, I think belongs there. Johnny Newman was one that like had an under the radar, pretty good career as a role player.
Yeah.
Skiles, Duckworth. I mean, even though Duckworth made a couple All Star teams, it was almost flash in the pan kind of seasons.
So, and we have a future coach, Nate McMillan.
Nate McMillan, I have as top 15. Um, And then there were like you get into role players, and that's the thing about drafts essentially. Like once you start getting into the even number 10 or early teens, then you start seeing like role players. So
Yeah.
that's why I think in general first round picks can sometimes be overrated because you're just getting role players past a certain point. But then but you have like Nate McMillan, Buck Johnson, David Wingate, so Larry Kristoyak, who's still like a college coach. So
Mm-hmm.
an interesting player to me, and it's kind of a what if for a different reason. Deremy is
Mm-hmm.
I know you probably know a lot about Big East basketball from the
Just,
80s.
yeah.
It's
I
Walter
was.
Berry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Walter. There's. I was thinking of both those guys, um, who
And
are
then
connected.
mhm,
Honestly, from I think it was the 80, either the 85 or 86 Big East tournament,
mhm,
where Pearl's going up for like their St. John Syracuse, and Walter Berry blocks Pearl's shot at
yeah.
the end, and Walter Berry was, for those Lou Carnesecca mid 80s teams, which in New York City, people still talk about the Big East and those St. John's teams that they went to the Final Four with Mullen and Mark Jackson. People
Mhm,
say, well, as great as Chris Mullen was and Mark Jackson, Walter Berry was the guy everyone looked at, just a great athlete, transfer kind of guy. So
yeah.
Walter Berry's a what if, and we talked about earlier the explosion of college basketball, and I think it starts with Bird and Magic, but then a big part of it was the Big East in the early 80s. And the foundation of that was three guys as far as players. Now, the coaches were great personalities, but it's Ewing, it's Chris Mullen, and it's Pearl Washington. And Pearl, one of the most exciting players college basketball ever had, and a New York legend. Before the internet, before things going viral, he was, going viral in New York. Hey, this guy Pearl dropped 60 in this high school game in New York. Back when New York had that reputation of like, oh, you're from New York, you must be great, a prospect. That's kind of changed now, but for a while it was like, oh, but a New York point guard, especially, you got a
Mhm.
lot of hype. And those two guys, Walter Berry and Pearl, did not hit it in the NBA, so they're big time what ifs.
Yeah, I know why Walter Berry didn't hit in the NBA, but I'm curious about Pearl Washington. And I don't even know if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, hit. Oh, my fault. Go ahead.
Okay.
Um, it was more of with him, his game didn't translate, but it was kind of like those things of he was so exciting. We saw him, so he had a little bit of injury
Mhm,
as well, like couldn't stay healthy. But a big part of it was his game. He wasn't as quick. If you watch Pearl's game, and now it's easy to see,
mhm.
but he had great moves. He had great shake and bake, but he wasn't as quick, and he couldn't take the whole kind of grind of the NBA. So he kind of flamed out from there. So that kind of
Okay.
what hurt Pearl as
Okay.
far as in that going to that next level.
Yeah, and with Walter Berry, it was more so part of it was his game. Like he was an undersized kind of forward. He didn't really
Mm-hmm.
have much he wasn't like a stretch forward necessarily. So his being his size and being a lot of his style was a lot of back to the basket, it didn't totally translate. But him was also like attitude, work ethic, entitlement kind of things. He
Yeah.
came in and I think he started with San Antonio and he just rubbed everybody the wrong way. He put up stats like he could still score a little bit, but I think he rubbed everybody the wrong way. He felt like he was the national player of the year at St. John's and he came in and felt like he was owed something apparently, and there were just like teams just had enough of him pretty quickly, and I think that's kind of what did Walter Berry. And he could have had a longer career, probably not as a star or an all star, but he could have had a longer career as a, well, I'll get you 12 points a game
Hmm.
and made a career out of it. But he just, his attitude kind of, he forced himself out of the
and
league.
and a lot of it, because like you made great points, and like I don't want to pass the buck. The accountability, it starts and ends with Walter Berry on that one, But I look at it like just knowing Larry Brown and him getting Larry Brown
Oof.
in San Antonio, and knowing how LB, especially pre the AI, even with AI, like him and like those kind of players like that, there's just
They
no,
don't mesh.
they don't mesh at all. So it's like that doesn't
That's a
help.
good
I mean,
point.
it doesn't help a guy like, and Walter Berry, that ego. Um, that's what I think. What I love about Dean Smith. We talk about loving Carolina and what has left Carolina prospects since he retired. Um, was Dean Smith. Carolina was on top. So you look at a guy, hey, people know inside the NBA, Kenny Smith, and he's a role player. People know him as, he's not as good as Shaq and Chuck. He's a role player on those title teams. Very true. But give Kenny Smith credit where high school All American, an All American at North Carolina, like a top 10 draft pick in '87, the year after this draft, and all that hype, but could adapt and become a role player when he was a star for so long. And that's what I love about Dean Smith's guys. And I think, speaking on NBA draft, is having guys who were stars but then came into the league and adapted to being a role player. It's not as easy as we see. Walter Berry couldn't do it. A lot of these guys we're naming could not adapt and become role players, but Dean Smith in Carolina did that with a lot of these guys. I think that's a
That's
testament to him.
such a good point. Rick Fox became one of like the more notable role
Mm-hmm.
players on the
Yeah.
Lakers, and he's a Dean Smith guy. Phil Ford was cut in that mold. He's a what if. I think with him it was injuries and he had some substance abuse issues, I believe. But Phil
Mm-hmm.
Ford was kind of cut in the same mold, where he was a superstar and he ended up being productive for a couple years in the NBA, um, but he had the personality that I think that would have transitioned into
Yeah.
like being serviceable, doing what it takes to win kind of guy.
No, no. And I think how much of that just, to just because it popped up to rap, like, do you think affected these guys and also to today where you're the star for so long? I mean, we're not even talking about growing up, but even in high school to college, you're the man. And then in the NBA, you're kind of seeing maybe some quicker than others that you may have a place, but you're not going to be the star. Like how hard how much of that you think is a factor in guys looking at '86, but even after to today of that kind of messing with them and being hard.
Oh, it's one of the I think checking your ego or being willing to accept a role as not the best player is one of the main things that helps guys stick. I mean, I honestly think that, and I know his game was more of not for the time. It was like a dinosaurs kind of game, but like Jahlil Okafor, I think probably could have had some sort of role in the league if he would have like saying, you know what, like I was a scorer, I was the high school All American, I was a college All American, I was a scorer, but that style is not working in today's NBA. Let me work on my defense. Let me try to extend my range. Let me do, and I think somebody like Jahlil Okafor maybe
Right.
would have been well served understanding that he wasn't going to be like the superstar that he was in high school and college. I think somebody who's amazed me, who's changed their game like in a way that I never thought they would is Brooke Lopez. So he
Mm-hmm.
was like he when he came into the league, he was a back to the basket scorer who didn't play defense. Now he's a 3-point shooter who's one of the best defenders in the league, and that blows my
Right.
mind. And Brooke Lopez is an
Absolutely.
example of like somebody like if you can change your game, like you can. You just have to be willing to accept a different role. So you see guys like I can look at my redrafts, and a lot of guys that didn't hit probably succumb, like who are high picks probably succumb to the same thing. Like maybe like somebody recently like Josh Jackson, I don't think he I think he had grander visions for himself and didn't quite adjust his game to what needed to be and what it needed to be. I think Cam Reddish might be falling into the same thing
Yeah, for sure.
lately, and I think you hit the nail on the head as far as like you're probably not going to be the star. That's just it's a
Hmm.
numbers game, and you were the star in high school, maybe college, but this is the NBA. Like you're not going to be LeBron or Jordan or Curry most likely. So
And
what can you do to stick?
I think that's, as much as this draft has so many sad stories, I think that's a testament to, for '86, Ron Harper,
Mhm.
for John Sally. Like those two guys could do it. I think Washington and Barry struggled with that, but Del Curry, like guys who did adapt and did those things, like to not just be the stars like they were in college, but to find their way, find their Chuck Person,
Mhm.
to do that. So I think it's a testament to both. It's a testament to, is such an underrated, but I think it's the key for a lot of guys making it in the league, which is, I feel like pretty quickly, coaches and definitely the players themselves. All right, I'm not going to be the man here. Like I was the man, I'm not going to be the man here. What can I do to fit for this team, but greatly in the NBA? Oh, I can, rebounding. We all need a rebounder. Let me work on being that good rebounder. Hey, being this guy who can come in and help defend, help hit. I can hit the open J. I think that's a big thing that gets talked about, but not enough with young guys. Looking at the draft, of being like, all right, you kind of know who you are pretty quick. What are you going to do to adapt and keep that job?
Can you imagine going through life being better than almost everybody that you've encountered at something, and then getting to a level where all of a sudden a lot of guys are better than you and having to admit that? Like I can
Yeah,
imagine how hard that is to admit, but I think it does take some like real sitting down with yourself with a trusted person and confidant and just really exploring it and having to understand like, you know what, it's not a bad thing. Like I'm still one of the best couple hundred people in the world at this. Just
right.
because I'm not one of the top 10 or 20, that's okay. And having to like have that conversation with yourself, I imagine that's really hard when all you were used to is just being better than everybody all the time.
No, I think you're right. That's a great point. That it's not easy. I don't want to make people. And you're
Yeah.
absolutely right, Tom. It's a hard thing, and I think that makes it even harder today because now you're so specialized. In '86, guys, people played all sports. Basketball could be your top sport, but maybe you played baseball or you played whatever, soccer. You wanted to play football. Like now, you're just wired to just being, you play ball all year round and you don't play any other sport. So now it's really like you're supposed to be the best. You're supposed to be the best, and then you're not.
Hmm.
Like that really hits that ego, and I feel like it's really hard. That's why I don't put Rodman in that category, because as hardworking and great a player, he was always the underdog.
Right.
So it was. I think that's what made it so easy, was he came in and said, "Oh, of course I'm going to rebound, do the dirty work." But like John Sally was a top pick, that was an adjustment for him. It had to have been, and other guys that had to adjust to it. So I think
Exactly.
that is the key. Like it just is having the right situation. Well, first of all, yourself, but then whether it be in the agent, whether it being coaches, being real with you and being like, you're not going to die. You're not going to average 25 like you did
Right.
in college, but you
Right.
still can have an impact.
Yeah, exactly. There's two guys on the positive side recently who I think maybe weren't the superstars that they envisioned, but actually have settled into good role player
Hmm.
role. Markel Fultz, I think, is turning into that. He's going to be
Yeah.
a really good, like, steady guard. Not going to be a superstar, but he's going to be steady. And then Lonzo Ball, I think, was trending there as far as like, okay, I know who I am. I'm going to play defense. I'm going to shoot threes. I'm going to be active. I'm going to pass the ball. Unfortunately, he's been I hope he plays again because his
I do too.
situation is really bad. But he and Lonzo Ball and Markel Fultz are examples of the positive thing that we're talking about is two superstars who probably had realizations that they weren't going to be like perennial all stars and adjusted correctly.
Yeah, and the names you gave, one was a first overall pick, the other a second
Yeah,
overall
they were the
pick.
top
So
two picks in their draft. I mean,
yeah,
yeah,
but I think that's a lesson that we all can use, but especially if we get that in the head of younger athletes going forward, we can kind of get that saying like, hey, you're still can have a great career. You're still a value to this league slash a team if you can check that ego and adjust and like be willing to do that. So
yeah.
Thomas, I'll give you the final word, man. How do you sum up this a draft? I think is like no other as far as the four major North American sports. I think this draft is like no other in history. The 1986 draft. So a lot of pressure. Sorry, but how would you sum up? How would you sum this draft up?
It's an unfortunate draft in many ways. I think it was a pivotal draft as far as we talked about how it changed the fortunes of a couple of franchises, at least Detroit and Cleveland, but it also changed the scope of the NBA as far as like cleaning it up,
Yeah,
like trying to get drugs out of the NBA and things of that nature. So I think pivotal in the sense that like some tragedies happened, but it was that pivot point to ultimately think some good things came out of this draft. Some learning lessons, some harsh learning lessons came out of this draft. But I think it's one of the most pivotal drafts probably in sports history.
no. Well said, my friend. Well said. Um, Thomas, this was awesome, and thank you because there's a lot of things we could have done, but I'm glad you went on this journey with me to look back at, like you said, this pivotal '86 NBA draft, man. And this was a lot of fun doing these episodes with you, man. So thank you so much, and I'll let you plug away on your podcast, the SNL Hall of Fame.
Yes, sir. So we do the SNL Hall of Fame. It's myself and Jamie Dew and Matt Ardill do the SNL Hall of Fame. And please go back. You can find us on really anywhere that you get your podcast. Go give us a subscribe. Listen to some past episodes. So the conceit of the podcast is like how it sounds, the SNL Hall of Fame. So we talk about a nominee each episode, and then we do voting at the end of each season. And I actually look back at these episodes as I mean the SNL Hall of Fame is like the conceit and it's a really wonderful thing, but I think these are great standalone episodes as far as just having 45-minute to hour discussions of people who were important to SNL
Yeah.
history. And I
Mm-hmm.
think they're evergreen episodes. I think you could go back to seasons 1, 2 and listen to these episodes and still get something out of it you know, even though they may not still be on the ballot because they might have already been inducted into the SNL Hall of Fame. You could still go back and listen to like the episode on Dave Grohl or Will Ferrell and get something out of it. Dick Ebersol, who Darren
Yeah.
my guest on. So I think these are just good. Like if you're an SNL fan, these are really neat snapshots and really neat discussions that you could go back and listen to and explore SNL history. And we just finished wrapping up voting, and we announced the class of the season 3 class of the SNL Hall of Fame. So go listen to that. Season 4 will start here in September. We actually did a draft. Me and Matt and John Schneider from the Saturday Night Network did a draft to pick the 15 new candidates for season 4. Deremy is going to be my guest for Adam McKay, who's being nominated as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
That'll be fun. We have 14 other nominees that we're excited to be doing shows on. So just follow us, give us a listen, give us a chance. I think we do good stuff, and Jeremy's been a part of it, and it's been wonderful.
No, no, and I'm so grateful that you guys have had me on. I was a fan of the show, and I was just like, I wanted this is my kind of thing. I reached out, and I'm so grateful to be on. It's an awesome show, great listen, great discussion on SNL, on impact, on comedy, on culture, on legacy, and also on. I want people to know that Thomas, you were on. We have some wrestling on this episode, so you were a guest on Chris Jericho. Talk is Jericho's podcast
Yes.
a little bit, which I was like, that is so cool. You told me to look
It
out
was
for that.
completely surreal. Like Jamie Dew and I appeared on Talk is Jericho with Chris Jericho back in January
Yeah.
of this year, and we talked about we did our top 10 me and Jamie and Chris Jericho did our top 10 cast members in SNL history. So that was like surreal to talk to Chris Jericho and be a part of that. So yeah, go check out our Chris Jericho episode too. If you want to
Yeah,
talk Chris
it was
Jericho.
awesome.
Yeah.
And Jericho, I knew that you and Jamie were going to be
Uh-huh.
ready. I was impressed with Jericho's
He did his research.
knowledge.
Yeah, he
Yeah,
really did. He came
yeah.
prepared.
So I was like, because I was like, I wonder how Jericho's going to do with this, but he did very well.
Mhm.
I give him props, and he knew what he was talking about. It was a fun episode. I like Jericho's podcast anyway, but that was a fun episode. I got to tell people I know that guy. I know Thomas, so
Yeah,
I'm
find
like,
us
that's
with Chris
cool.
Jericho.
Yep. So so check that episode out. Check out SNL Hall of Fame and continue to like, subscribe on podcast apps for Bigger Than the Game with Deremy and Jose, and also our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe as well. So for our special guest Thomas Sena, I'm Deremy Dove. Thank you guys for listening to Bigger Than the Game with Deremy and Jose.